Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. You know, General of the U.S. Army, Winfield Scott, life date 1786 to 1866, the Virginia born beloved commander, known affectionately as Old Fuss and Feathers for maximum military etiquette. According to federal regulations, that's how he lived. His leadership during the Mexican War and a presidential bid in 1852 on the Whig Party ticket, losing to rival General Franklin Pierce. Not his finest moment, but still revered him to many Americans for becoming a leader on the national stage. You students of the Civil War know Scott for his Anaconda Plan, that naval blockade along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts, the Mississippi River, and other waterways to choke the economic life out of the Confederacy, and for the realization that he was too old and infirm to be the commander needed in wartime, and making the supreme effort to step aside to make way for the charismatic and celebrated young general George B. McClellan, who came to be beloved in his own right as Little Mac, and also a failed presidential bid just like Scott. This illustration of Scott is one of my favorites. It shows him at the height of his power in 1861, the aging hero of the young republic, called once more to duty to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. Notice the flag flying, furling behind him, the feathers in his chapeau also catching the wind, it looks like. And also notice that the artist engraver depicted the Capitol building with the dome that's complete. Of course, you students of American history know that the dome wasn't completed until the end of the Civil War. Perhaps this was the artist's suggestion that Scott was the man to lead the nation on to victory and to reunification. There are two anecdotes about General Scott that are perhaps lesser known to you Civil War students. One of them is a question of his loyalty. Remember, he's a Virginian, and his plan to end the war before it began, which I refer to as the Garrison Plan. There's this pair of anecdotes. They're told together by Edward D. Townsend, the West Point educated officer and loyal assistant adjutant general who spent the entire war circulating in and about Washington, D.C., among the top brass and politicians. Townsend shared these anecdotes, the ones I'm going to share with you in a moment, as part of his 1884 book, Anecdotes of the Civil War in the United States. Before I read them to you, listen for mentions of President James Buchanan and his Secretary of War, John B. Floyd later, a Confederate general, U.S. Senators Stephen Douglas and John J. Crittenden, Virginia Judge William J. Robertson, and North Carolina Governor John Moorhead. So, let me begin. This is Townsend in his own words. He writes, for some unaccountable reason, efforts have been made since General Scott's death, recall in 1866, to throw doubts upon his real loyalty to the Union. In 1860 and 1861, much anxiety was felt to ascertain what course he would take. The papers of the day, however, furnished abundant evidence that the tribute paid in a letter of April 30th, 1861, addressed to him by Alexander Henry, Horace Binney, W.M. Meredith, and others, was only just. This is an extract from that letter. Quote, at a time like this, when Americans, distinguished by the favor of their country, entrenched in power, and otherwise high in influence and station, civil and military, are renouncing their allegiance to the flag they have sworn to support. Of course, we're talking about the secessionists who were leaving the Union. It is an inexpressible source of consolation and pride to us to know that the general in chief of the army remains like an impregnable fortress at the post of duty and glory, and that he will continue to the last to uphold that flag and to defend it, if necessary, with his sword, even if his native state should assail it. End quote. There's more. The Charleston Mercury, South Carolina, of April 22nd, 1861, stated that, quote, a positive announcement was made at Montgomery, Alabama, that General Scott had resigned his position in the Army of the United States and tendered his sword to his native state, Virginia. At Mobile, 100 guns were fired in honor of his resignation, end quote. This shows something of the estimated value of the general's influence. Of course, Scott never resigned. This was a rumor that made its way to the first capital of the Confederacy. Many efforts were made to induce him to resign, but he never once wavered in his devotion to the Union, whatever may be thought of the wisdom of his views, which, like those of everyone, may be open to criticism. On one occasion, Judge Robertson, a small, thin, but venerable-looking man, came to Washington with 2 other Virginia gentlemen to offer General Scott, the commander-in-chief of the Army of Virginia, together with an estate belonging to the Commonwealth and esteemed the most valuable in Virginia, if he would abandon the United States service and go with the South. The general listened in silence as Robertson feelingly recalled the days when they were schoolboys together, and then spoke of the warm attachment Virginians always cherished for their state, and of their boasted allegiance to it above all other political ties. But when he began to unfold his offer of a commission and estate, the noble old soldier stopped him, exclaiming, "Friend Robertson, go no further. It is best that we part here before you compel me to resent a mortal insult." Robertson and his friends at once took their departure, and I never saw them as they descended the stairs looking much discomfited. Senator Douglas delivered a speech in Ohio in which he said he had been asked whether there was truth in the rumor that General Scott was about to resign. "Why," said the senator, "it is almost profanity to ask that question. I saw him only last Saturday. He was at his desk, pen in hand, writing his orders for the defense and safety of the American capital." The senator then detailed a conversation he had had with Judge Robertson, in which the latter corroborated the account of the interview just narrated. General Scott answered an inquiry from his old and valued friend, Senator J.J. Crittenden, as to his reported intention to resign. "I have not changed. Always a Union man." Just before actual non-intercourse between the sections, Governor Moorhead of North Carolina, an old friend of General Scott, came one morning to his office. He had been to Philadelphia to withdraw his daughter from school and take her home while travel was yet uninterrupted. The interview between the old friends was very affecting. Both deprecated the prospect so imminent of a separation of the states. Not a suggestion was hinted that they might soon be together in the new Confederacy, but their parting was evidently viewed by both as final. The governor shortly arose and bade a mournful farewell. He then said his daughter, a sweet young lady, who was in the carriage below, wished very much to see General Scott once more, and asked if she might come. Of course, a ready assent was given, and she presently appeared. A few parting words of regret were spoken, and she, bending over the general as he sat in his chair, kissed him reverently on the forehead. Tears streamed down the cheeks of father and daughter as they silently withdrew. On Monday, May 6, 1861, in obedience to orders from the War Department requiring all officers to specially renew their oath of allegiance to the United States, The oath was administered to General Scott in his office and at the same time to his staff. In October 1860, 6 months before he retook the oath, before any events had occurred to show what the future would certainly bring forth, to be sure, the advice to send troops to reinforce the posts, talking about Fort Moultrie and then later Fort Sumter, seems absurd in view of the very small number he reported as available. But as in duty bound, when submitting his recommendations, he represented the full extent of his own resources, leaving it to the president to use his constitutional powers to provide the means. A few weeks later, when there was a will, a way was really found to raise all the troops needed. There is an obvious reason why, in the agitated state of the public mind, General Scott ought not to have made a specific recommendation in writing on this head. As to the Southern sentiment, it was seen in the furious denunciations of him in Southern papers when his real position came to be known. The secession estimate of his views was announced at the reception tendered to Mr. Floyd in Richmond after he resigned his place in President Buchanan's cabinet. In these words, Floyd reportedly said, "The plan invented by General Scott to stop secession was, like all campaigns devised by him, very able in its details and nearly certain of general success. The Southern states are full of arsenals and forts commanding their rivers and strategic points. General Scott desired to transfer the Army of the United States to these forts as speedily and as quietly as possible. The Southern states could not cut off communication between the government and the fortresses without a great fleet, which they cannot build for years, or take them by land without 100,000 men, many hundred millions of dollars, several campaigns, and many a bloody siege. Had Scott been able to have got those forts in the condition he desired them to be, i.e., populated by American troops, by Union troops, the Southern Confederacy would not now exist." So there you have recollections, anecdotes by General Townsend, Assistant Adjutant General in the War Department, writing of events in 1861, testifying to the loyalty of the Virginian, Winfield Scott, and his Garrison Plan to populate all of the forts and arsenals and other federal government installations throughout the rebellious Southern states with troops to be able to end hostilities before they began. So thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.